Dear students, let us start the discussion on today's newspaper, that is 12th February 2016. The first article is related to the GDP growth and the new calculation, how it has led to certain misunderstandings or mispresentations about the GDP growth. You know that we have changed the way we calculate our GDP last year. That is, we have taken up the United Nations System of National Accounts 2008 as a basis. And along with this, the National Account Statistics has took 2011-12 as a base year. Generally, when a base year changes, it will not change the growth rate, but it will change the aggregate level of the or absolute level of the GDP. But this time, there are many other changes that have occurred simultaneously, which have changed the growth rate rather than the absolute level of GDP. Surprisingly, when the base year changed this time, the absolute level of GDP has decreased, but the growth rates have increased. What are the reasons to it? So the proportion of value assigned to different figures over here, that is, household sector and private corporate sector have changed significantly. The private corporate sector's value has increased from 23% to 34%, and household sector has shrunk from 56% to 45%. In this case, for the private corporate sector, Ministry of Corporate Affairs MCA 21 data was taken as a basis. So in this context, the total enterprises in India are estimated close to 1 million. So the major challenge is this. So if you carefully observe the public sector listed companies, they are very small proportion in India, and many of them are private companies. And most of these private companies are so-called as partnership companies, proprietorship companies. All these are created for tax evasion in India. So in this context, what we can say is this. So 1 million plus companies though estimated, in that more than 50% of the GDP calculations are from these small companies. Many of these companies will be suitcase companies or else shallow companies which are being created to siphon off the profits of the larger company. So in this case, the small accounting statistic which has been done by the large corporates also entered into our GDP calculation as a real GDP growth. It means, for example, a company, it has got 100 crores as a profit. So the company promoters, they wanted to evade the tax for that. So they tried to show 2 or 3 shell companies and try to siphon off these funds as to this particular other organizations. It means that this 100 crore rupees is being duplicated twice into the account books as a production, the production of these 3 small companies too. So this duplication of work has led to the overestimate of the private sector component. Now on the other hand, taking the glimpse of the household sector, our clear output of the household sector is always difficult. It comes through the national sample surveys. So in this context, the self-employed worker contribution is underestimated in the present calculation. Because of this, this particular sector showed a decline. So in this context, the private sector is growing in India. So to the growth of the private sector and its contribution has increased in the GDP calculation, the household sector contribution is decreasing and its weightage has drastically decreased. Because it means that the growing sector has got a greater weightage and the household sector which is receding has got a lesser weightage. That showed a higher projection in the growth. That's what the article talks about. Higher education in Kerala. Recently you saw in Kovalam, there is an attack on a retired IFS officer who was holding the Global Education Summit. So in this context, if you see Rashtriya Uchchatan Vidya Yojana, it did not provide for the sufficient funds to the states, and also states are at the level of the bankruptcy, then how the higher education have to be expanded and quality has to be improved. The major sources will be private investment, collaborations, research collaborations, and the foreign universities. In this context, opposing for a competition and a change by the conservative elements has to be seen mostly as a retrograde step over here. Coming to the Kaushik Basu article, this is a very beautiful article with regard to your e-governance chapter. So we generally talk about digital divide. So if you recollect the class, there are 3 points which I discussed. One is network has to be there, and then we shall have the capability for the people to use. So e-participation to occur, the human capabilities are important. These human capabilities depend upon the educational levels of the people, and the network is very much important. It is to provide for access across the digital divide, or the digital divide has to, challenge of digital divide has to be addressed. The third thing is the government has to facilitate the change occurring through the digital transformation. So you need to have proper governance framework. So in India, you don't have a legality or else proper specific law governing the e-governance. And human capabilities are also very low. The capability gap is very high. The digital divide is also very high in the country. So if you compare to China, not only the digital divide access gap, we also have digital divide capability gap in India. So finally, we also have the governance gap in India. Coming to the Rangarajan article, so it is about reduction in corporate tax and plugging the exemptions. Exemptions have to be reduced. And the second is the private sector investment is decreasing. The public sector investment has to be increased, and a clear predictability has to be provided in which sectors the public sector investment is coming up. It also boosts the private sector investment in those areas. Now the fiscal deficit is very much necessary for macroeconomic stability, and it shall not be compromised. So in this case, he specifically talks about the 7th Pay Commission report, which is going to add an additional burden of 0.4% to the GDP. So the government has to rethink on this 0.4% of increase in GDP, expenditure to the economy. Finally, the agricultural sector also needs a sufficient focus and capital investment flow into that. So these are the 4 points he spoke about. Now, Russians rise stakes in Syria. You know that after the military intervention of Russia in Syria, the Assad has gained the strength. Now he has control over most of the Syria. So in this context, the US, which was against to the direct intervention in Syria and supporting the rebels through the backdoor channels, is on defensive now, and it feels that its bargaining power in the ongoing peace process has substantially reduced. But however, if you see this war statistics, almost 11.5% of the population of Syria either it is displaced or injured or died in the process of this particular war. This explains the human costs of this dirty war which is going on in Syria. Coming to the bank balance sheets, Rangarajan's article. Now, what he says is, so the RBI has conducted something called asset quality review. So, as poor assets, NPAs of the banks have increased. So they have the net effect on the profitability of the banks this quarter. But however, in the long run, the restructuring of the RLs, asset quality classification of the banks, will lead to a better performance and also the better economic growth. So he also said that there is no need to panic about the stressed assets based on the RBI estimates. Here let us understand what is a stressed asset mean. So it is an asset that includes NPAs plus restructured assets. So the loan restructuring asset, etc., that also comes under the stressed assets. Coming to the New Hampshire results, in United States, Mr. Trump has won from the New Hampshire from Republican primary, and Bernie Sanders from the Democratic side. So in this context, how it will influence the elections in the future? The Bernie Sanders started getting huge donations, private donations, but however, Hillary still enjoys the greatest support among the African Americans. The ongoing Carolinas, North Carolina, and where the significant African American population exists, it will be a big challenge to the Bernie Sanders. On the other hand, the Trump, who was talking about racial factors, etc., in his elections, he also has won with significant majority in New Hampshire. Now, the extreme thoughts are gaining a significance or momentum in American election race. It shows that the 1990s with Clinton era, the politics of pragmatism rather than ideology, they appear to be taken a backseat with regard to the present elections. Coming to the Terry's, the Mr. Pachori's reappointment. He was reappointed as the executive vice chairman of the Energy and Research Institute. Now it is an institute of global significance. In this context, the sexual harassment of the women at the workplace, Prevention and Prohibition and Redressal Act 2013. So this act has to be implemented in letter and spirit. But however, this reappointment is a blot on that particular implementation of this act and also the institution, the Terry. These are the important articles for today. Thank you very much. All the best.